In this movie, I'm going to demonstrate how to take a traditional line drawing and develop it inside of Photoshop so that you can later trace it in Illustrator. So what we'll be doing is we'll take this image, and you may recall that it was a two-part process. I drew the skull first, and then I scanned it into Photoshop, made some modifications, printed the skull at a reduced size so that I could draw these sabers in the background in a second pass. Everything was rendered with a Sharpie, however, so we don't have as much contrast as I'd like. And not only that, I want to make some modifications too. This is the time to do it inside of Photoshop before you trace the line art inside of Illustrator. You can always make more modifications inside Illustrator if you want to, but you might as well get things as close to right as possible inside of Photoshop now. And I ultimately want to come up with this result here. Now, you might look at this image, once again, here inside Photoshop and think, well, gosh, this looks just fine. Why do we need to take it into Illustrator at all? Well, recall that I drew this image on an 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of paper, and I want to print the flag 5 feet wide by 3 feet tall. That's a huge increase in size. So if I were to go up to the image menu, for example, and choose the image size command, and I turn off the resample image checkbox for a moment so I can just dial in a different size without adding pixels, I'll change this value to 60 inches, let's say, which is 5 feet wide, and that reduces the resolution to 60 pixels per inch. Well, that's just not enough resolution, so I'm going to cancel out of there. Photoshop allows you to upsample an image, but it's not going to do a good job of inventing pixels, especially if the transitions between the existing pixels are a little soft in the first place. So I've zoomed in to 100% here, and you can see these are typical Sharpie lines. That is, the ink is bleeding into the paper a little bit, and we have sort of these thick and gooey edges. I would rather these edges be absolutely razor sharp, and that is a service that Illustrator affords me. That's what we get from vectors. All right, I'm going to zoom back out of this illustration. We're going to start things off inside of this one. So I'm going to develop this guy, and I'm going to make a few different modifications. I'm going to adjust the angle of this handle so that it's not touching the jaw of the skeleton. And then I'm going to basically finesse the structure of the skull using the liquefy command. And then finally, we'll go ahead and increase the contrast. So I'm going to zoom in on the handle of this saber. And I'm going to go ahead and select it using my lasso tool. Now, one of the great things here is that because I output the skull from a printer and then I drew the handle using a Sharpie, I can see the distinction between those two areas. So I can just follow that. I can actually trace that edge using the lasso. So I'm alt-clicking or option-clicking along this edge in order to take advantage of the polygonal lasso function. And I'll just go ahead and cut through the first few millimeters of the blade there around the handle, and that's okay because I can always rebuild those details in just a moment. And then I'll go ahead and drag down to here and complete my selection like so. Now I'm working on a background layer, so what that means is as long as the background color is white, which it is in my case, I will leave some whiteness behind as I rotate this handle into a better position. So I'm going to zoom out just so I can see the angle of the saber blade a little bit better. And then I'll go up to the edit menu, and I'll choose the free transform command. And this one command is how you scale and rotate and otherwise transform selections and layers inside of Photoshop. You can also press Control-T, that's Command-T on the Mac. I'm going to move this central target point to right about there so that we're rotating along that edge of the blade. And now I'll move my cursor outside of the selection and I'll drag like so in order to apply that rotation. And I want to rotate it as far as I can, essentially, because I really wanted to get this edge away from the jaw. But I don't want to rotate it so far that it looks like the angle no longer matches the blade. So I think right about here looks pretty darn good, actually. And I'll just go ahead and press the Enter key or the Return key on a Mac in order to accept that modification. Then I'll click outside of the selection in order to deselect it. Now I've got to rebuild these details right here. And I'm going to do that just by selecting some areas and either pressing Control Backspace or Command Delete on the Mac to fill that area with white. Or I could draw around here, this area that should be black, and I've got my foreground and background colors set to their defaults, which are black and white. You can ensure that that's the way it is by pressing the D key, as in default. And then press Alt Backspace or Option Delete to fill that area with black. Now, you might look at that and say, well, that's not a good match, Deke. We've got this jet black area that you just filled, and then out here we have this dark gray area. Well, the dark gray area will be black before we're done. We will increase the contrast of this image using the Levels command, just not yet. It's better to get this other work done beforehand. I'll go ahead and drag around this area, and maybe I'll try to firm that up a little bit by Alt dragging or Option dragging to deselect that region there. And I'll fill that area with black as well by pressing Alt Backspace or Option Delete. And I'll go ahead and connect this area. And you might wonder, well, why am I using the lasso tool and filling by pressing Alt Backspace or Option Delete? Why don't I just grab the paintbrush tool and paint with it instead? Well, I just find for this kind of work that the lasso tool gives me greater control because I can specify the size of the area that I want to fill before I go and apply the color. Anyway, now I've gone ahead and added the color that's necessary to fuse those areas together, and that should work out okay. We've got some weird little edges going on there, but nothing that troubles me too much. Now then, I need to make some changes using Liquify, and here's a little trick, and this is an old school trick. Basically, the idea is as you develop a piece of artwork, as you're drawing it, you tend to become accustomed to it. You sort of fall in love with it. You grow to know the good things about it, but you don't necessarily see the defects. And a way to wake up the image so that you're taking a new look at it, it's a very simple technique. You go up to the image menu, you choose image rotation, and you choose flip canvas horizontal. And what that does is it just forces you to take a new look at this image because it doesn't really matter if it's flipped one direction or flipped the other direction. That doesn't change the basic composition of the image, but it does force you to reappraise it. And this is true for portrait shots as well. It's a great thing to do if you're retouching a portrait. Just go ahead and flip it horizontally, forces you to take a new view of that image. And then go ahead and modify the flipped version of the image. Now I'm going to do that by going to the filter menu and choosing the Liquify command, or pressing Control-Shift-X, Command-Shift-X on the Mac. We usually think of this command as being useful for adjusting portrait shots and models and that kind of thing. It's actually exceptionally well suited to modifying line art like this. So I'll go ahead and choose the command. And the first thing I noticed when I was working here inside of Liquify is that the blade over here on the right-hand side is much thicker than the blade on the left-hand side. So I increased the size of my cursor quite a bit, and I'm doing that by pressing Shift along with the right bracket key. And then I grab this tool right there, the bloat tool. And you don't want to just drag with this tool because you get that kind of horrible effect there. Instead, what you do, I undid that by pressing Control-Z, Command-Z on the Mac. You just kind of click every so often in order to basically bulge out certain areas at a time. So you just click very gently on the blade. You have to be pretty deliberate about it. You do have to be patient as well in order to get the results you're looking for. I also went ahead and increased the size once again of my cursor, and I used the traditional warp tool up here in order to move some details around. So I decided this eye over here on the left-hand side was looking too small vis-a-vis the one over on the right-hand side, and I wanted to draw out some of these cheek details as well, and I wanted to make the jaw a little taller like so. And I took it a little easier than this. I actually probably painted inside of this dialog box for a good 15 minutes. And I did go ahead and save out my settings. I saved my mesh, which is always a good idea. Once you get some decent results out of this filter, you want to click on the Save Mesh button before you click OK, before you accept the results. And that's going to save you a lot of effort in the future. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and load that mesh right now, the one that I saved in advance. And I called my mesh Skeletal Adjustments MSH. And so I'll go ahead and click on that saved mesh file, and then I'll click on the open button in order to apply it. And there is the final meshed version of the image. So to give you a sense of what I did, I'll press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac. This is the before version, what we were looking at just a moment ago. And then if I press Control-Z or Command-Z again, that's the after version, thanks to my modifications here inside the Liquify filter. I'll go ahead and click OK in order to apply those changes. And then finally, I'll go back up to the image menu, I'll choose image rotation again, and I'll choose flip image horizontal. And note that flipping is a non-destructive operation inside of Photoshop. And so I'll go ahead and choose the command in order to reinstate the skeleton looking to the right. We still have yet to increase the contrast of the image, and we need to add the red background. And those are changes that we will make in the next exercise.